Imagine that you were laid off work a couple months ago, and your budget for groceries is getting very tight. You decide to go to a food pantry, but when you arrive, you are asked for your identification. What questions might that trigger for you? How would that make you feel? Would you feel embarrassed? Feel like they don't trust you for some reason? What if you're someone without documentation? What messages might this requirement imply about you? How might it impact your willingness to come back in the future? What does it mean to require identification for people to get food from a food pantry? A few possible assumptions underneath this are that we believe that people without identification don't deserve food, that people in poverty are less trustworthy, or that we value accountability to funders more than making food available. These structures and narratives ultimately mean that some may feel unsafe or ashamed in getting the food that they need. And these narratives have implications and reinforce far beyond simply one rule or policy. This is just one example of how policies, structures, programs, and processes can be rooted in assumptions about people. But the truth is, we don't have to necessarily agree with harmful assumptions in order to perpetuate them. All of us are driven to feel connected and feel like we can count on others and they on us. Things are somewhat predictable, that we're safe, that we matter, and that we can influence our environment and future, and that our material needs can be met without shame and danger. These constitute our well-being. However, many of the current assumptions that underpin our systems undermine well-being for some. Our current systems are frequently based on assumptions that undermine well-being, and changing systems starts with seeing those assumptions. Here are some questions to ask to uproot assumptions. For whom is this rule, policy, or process for? Who benefits? What is the assumption made about those who are most oppressed or vulnerable? What is an alternative assumption that aligns with well-being? Now, let's look back on our example of requiring identification for accessing a food pantry. What would it look like to assume that we're more alike than different? That people are primarily trustworthy and are just trying to get their needs for well-being met, like the rest of us? That there are oppressions and inequities that undermine progress for some more than others? Through these questions, a new set of rules, policies, and structures begin to emerge. After we first identify the underlying assumptions, we can then take action. Here are some ideas. 1. If we can change the rule, policy, or process, let's change it. For example, do away with the identification requirement. Could there be something else asked instead? If what's actually needed is simply a name and not proof of identity, make it clear that people can provide a pseudonym instead. 2. Identify where these assumptions show up in processes and shift how people are talking about others who are systems involved. For example, when staff members or volunteers make blanket negative statements about people coming to the pantry, find ways to interrupt that thinking and reframe the story to be about systemic oppressions and burdens instead of putting the blame on the individual. 3. If the structure isn't immediately changeable because it requires legislation or approval by a board of trustees or other body, do what's possible to shift the impacts. For example, explain that it's an unchangeable requirement to ask for identification. Then, make it clear that you believe that people are trustworthy. 4. Let's examine our system and call on those with positional power to shift the practices, culture, policies, and structures that hold these assumptions in place. For example, appeal to decision makers to interrogate the reasons for the identification requirement and apply pressure to change them. It's possible to change systems and the assumptions embedded in them. Visit fullframeinitiative.org for resources and tools for shifting systems toward well-being and equity for all.